Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Lord Pickles, who at the time in which we're interested was the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good morning. I now call Lord Pickles, please.
Good morning, Lord Pickles.
Good morning.
I understand you're going to take the oath.
I am.
There should be a testament there, right? You know the drill. Would you read the words on the screen, please?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Would you like to sit down and make yourself comfortable, please?
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Millett, when you're ready.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Good morning to you. Good morning, members of the panel. Lord Pickles, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Can I start by thanking you very much for coming to the inquiry and assisting us with our investigations? We're extremely grateful to you. During your evidence, can I ask you please to keep your voice up so that the transcriber who sits to your right can get down everything you say slowly and clearly so we have a nice clean transcript. Can I also ask you please not to nod or shake your head, but say yes or no, as the case may be, as it may be. Can I also please just mention that during the course of my examination, you may misunderstand my question, you may want me to put the question in a different way. I'm happy to do that. Also, if you need a break at any other time, other than the scheduled times we're going to take, mid-morning and mid-afternoon, then let us know and we can take a short break. All right? Now, you've provided one witness statement to the inquiry, and I want to show it to you, please. It's at CLG 3019471.
Yes, I can see that on the screen.
Thank you. It's dated the 16th of January 2019. Could we go to page 25, please?
Could I just, is it possible to increase the font size?
Yes, of course. Could we do that?
Yes, you should.
There.
Most of the time, when we see documents, Lord Pickles, they often come up initially in quite small print.
Okay.
But generally, the passage that we're going to look at, you'll find, will be increased in size.
Yes, I may have spoke out of turn.
No, not at all.
I've now got it in
You're quite right to raise the point,
Yeah.
but it will generally be done.
Okay, so my apologies.
No, that's right. Thank you.
Now, on page 25, you'll see a statement of truth and a date, 16th of January 2019, and between the two, a signature. Is that your signature?
It is my signature.
Have you read this witness statement recently?
Yes, I took the opportunity of reading it over the weekend.
Very good. And do you say that the contents of it are true?
Yes.
Thank you. And before coming here today, have you discussed this statement or your evidence generally with anybody?
Only with the legal team from the department to get various documents, but not the substance.
Very good. Now, if we go please to page 1 of this statement, paragraph 5, you tell us that you were a Member of Parliament for Brentwood and Ongar from 1992 until 2017, is that right?
That is absolutely correct.
And can you set out for us, in brief if you can, your education and working life before you became an MP?
Before I became an MP, I was a consultant in employment practice, and I also did some work for a now defunct Conservative newspaper on local government. And I was a councillor at Bradford between 79 and I think 91. I was chairman of the Education Committee, chairman of Social Services, and eventually leader of the council.
And at paragraph 2 on page 1, you say that you held the position of Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government from 12th May 2010 to the 11th of May 2015. That was the coalition government, wasn't it?
That is correct.
Yes. And I think you were succeeded by Greg Clark as Secretary of State after the 2015 election. Is that right?
That is correct.
Before your appointment as Secretary of State, am I right in thinking that you had no involvement in that department?
That would be correct. We'd be in opposition. I did do the job for a brief time, a shadow, but for the year and a half before the election, I was chairman of the Conservative Party, so I didn't even know where the department was when I was appointed.
No, and no doubt you learned soon afterwards.
Yeah, fairly soon.
Yes. Now, had you had any governmental responsibility in a shadow capacity for fire policy before you became Secretary of State?
No.
Did you have any experience in any capacity in relation to fire safety at all?
No, other than putting down parliamentary questions, and I did front a demonstration of sprinklers by West Midlands Fire Authority at Anglia Ruskin University in the late 90s.
Now, on your appointment, did you receive any kind of induction or handover from either the outgoing minister or anybody within the department?
No, the outgoing minister, that would have been very unusual, I have to say. But of course there was an induction pack and a series of get-to-meet people over that period. Most of them were entirely new to me, people I'd never met before.
Yeah. Now, can we go to paragraph 11 of your statement on page 3? You say there, as Secretary of State, I had overall responsibility for the leadership and strategic direction of the department during the period of the coalition government formed by the Conservative and Liberal Democrat parties following the election on 6th May 2010. I was required to have and did have an overview of the work being done by the department. However, for obvious reasons, I could not have a detailed understanding of every element of that work, although I did become directly involved in the detail of certain specific issues.
That's correct.
In brief, what was the strategic direction, as you put it, of the department as you saw it in 2010?
I'll happily do that, but could I explain my powers, which I can do very quickly?
Yes.
I mean, basically there are two kinds of powers. One that relates to me personally, which have a discretion, and there are those that relate to my office. So, for example, outside the Crown Estate, I held the ownership of all government buildings, and in terms of planning, the planning authority, the planning inspectors have no powers. Their powers come from my office. But within that, I do have a discretion in terms of calling and retain powers for appeal. So that's why government departments are able to move. But in terms of priorities, clearly the big thing was localism, which was trying to devolve power from the centre down to local authorities and beyond. There was a residual worry with regard to the number of houses that were being built. We also had community cohesion, and it was a very difficult time when we were trying to move things along there in terms of involvement of Muslim and Jewish and other faiths and religions. So those were the basic strands. But for the first couple of years, I think localism and getting the Localism Act, which was the largest act passed in the Parliament, getting that through the process and getting it implemented.
Thank you. Now, when you became Secretary of State in May 2010, were you provided with an overview of the work being done by the department at the time?
Yes, in quite a ad hoc way. Obviously, it was a new government, so we weren't necessarily going to continue with the policies of the previous Labour government. Though in truth, when you're in government, it's not like campaigning. You have to have a pragmatic view in terms of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there were quite a lot of things that Labour had done that I agreed with.
Who provided you with an overview of the work being done?
My permanent secretary and also the office of my private office would coordinate and put briefings together. But my permanent secretary was leaving. He'd been appointed to become permanent secretary in Scotland. So one of the first things I was involved in was recruiting the new permanent secretary.
Right. Did you make decisions at the time about which areas of work being done by the department required your closer attention?
Yes, obviously localism was something that was very important, and also even though it was May, we needed to get ready for the revenue support grant. That's an extremely complex piece of work, and it was pretty much on its knees. And in terms of the importance of the department, it's roughly slightly over a quarter of all public expenditure comes through the department. So it's quite a big organisation. As I think you've had other ministers, it's being Secretary of State is pretty much full on, long hours, lots of reading, lots of boxes to go through. But I did volunteer for it.
As part of your introductory work and decision making, did any of the officials in the department bring to your attention any current issues or work being done in respect of the building regulations or the approved documents?
No, they didn't. But I did take a decision fairly early on in terms of responsibilities of government ministers, and I was determined that the housing minister and the person principally responsible for building regulations would be separate. My reasons for that, sir, was because I knew there would be a lot of pressure on for new build, and I wanted to put some creative tension to ensure that decisions on building regulations would be separate. It so happened that I had the added bonus of having a Liberal Democrat who was very interested in the subject, and I thought again it would act as a brake and remove temptation by doing so.
A Liberal Democrat very interested in which subject, housing or building regulations?
Building regulations, I'm sorry, I should have made that clear.
And who was that at the time of your...
That was Andrew Stunnell.
Andrew Stunnell, right.
And he remains very knowledgeable on the subject.
Yes. At the time, did anybody bring to your attention any issues or work being done in relation to fire safety?
No. I was, once the red tape challenge started, I was very determined that it would be exempt from the fire regulations would be exempt from that process.
When you say the fire regulations, what do you mean by that?
I mean the various. I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that. I mean, what I mean by that is fire regulations. That the previous Labour government had gone through a process of deregulation.
Do you mean, when you say fire regulations, the fire safety order?
I think so, yes. I think so, and I apologise for not being clear on that.
No,
But of course there obviously are some things that relate to fire within document B. I understand that.
We'll come to that.
Okay,
in detail
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump ahead.
But in asking the question, I just wanted to understand whether you meant the regulatory reform fire safety order.
Yeah, I did, and I apologise for not making that clear.
No, that's all right. Now, let's move on to how the department worked. Can we go, please, to paragraph 12 of your statement, just below 11 in the middle of your screen, where you say this: I should also emphasise that the department was not and is not an operational one. It works with local authorities, housing associations, fire and rescue services and other local bodies. The department's role is to guide and assist those local bodies in discharging their legal responsibilities at a local level. Now, when you say the department was not and is not an operational one, what do you mean by that?
It doesn't in itself produce a direct service to the public. It's a recognised term within government. We offer advice, we offer encouragement, we can control budgets, but we can't, we don't ourselves directly provide a service to the government. The largest budget would of course be local government, and that's provided by local authorities around the country. We were of course a devolved department, so I had no say in Scotland or in Wales, except for some reserved matters which reserved power which I never used.
How did your department, as you say, guide and assist local authorities in discharging their legal responsibilities, specifically in relation to the building regulations?
We would offer guidance. We would work very closely with the local government association, and we would try to keep those building regulations up to date. And Andrew Studden, Lord Studden, that is, was very keen to look at the regulations and to bring them up to date.
So do we take it from that your department had at least a degree of oversight of how the regulatory systems, particularly those relating to the building regulations, were working in practice?
We would, I would anticipate, I don't know for certain, but we would keep in very close contact with representatives of local government, and I think through that would perhaps pick up if there was any particular problems. We would hold regular seminars. We would often partner with the local government association, which wasn't very far from our own headquarters, and they were extraordinarily good at organising this kind of thing.
You say you would keep in close contact with local government. What about industry? Persons carrying out the work for the purposes of the Building Act?
I'm sure that took place, but I personally wasn't involved.
No.
My limited recollection on this is those various seminars that the Local Government Association would undertake would include representatives beyond local government.
Was it your understanding that the department was required to monitor how the regulatory system, particularly the building regulations, was being enforced?
I don't think I specifically knew that. I think I assumed that would be the case, because otherwise how would it be able to change regulation?
And working on that assumption, which team within your department did you understand or assume was doing that?
As Secretary of State, you tend to only see the people at the top. So I generally only saw, except for in very limited circumstances, I would only see the Director Generals. Occasionally you'd see a director. I knew it to be in what would be in Peter Schofield's directorship, and I did have I used to receive some subs from a Mr. Martin, who I think worked on building regulations, and someone in the fire team, forgive me if I've not got her name right, but I think it was Louise Upton. Does that I think is right?
If it's the person you're thinking of, then that is correct.
Yeah, okay.
And
but I wouldn't see Mr. Martin on a regular basis at all.
in general terms, Lord Pickles, how did you ensure that the department carried out those functions, those oversight and monitoring functions, effectively during your time as Secretary of State?
Well, there are two routes. There's obviously the permanent secretary, who I would see on a very regular basis, and my ministers. Below me, I think I had 2 or 3 ministers of state, and then below that parliamentary secretaries. In terms of generally running the department, because obviously we were in coalition, and I wanted to have a very clear message both to the ministers and also to officials, we used to meet on a Wednesday morning for what is called prayers, which became more structured under myself, and we would review progress on various key issues, look at what was happening contemporary. After a while, the suggestion of officials, I introduced a tracker that was designed. It was essentially a very elaborate Excel spreadsheet, but that was essentially to look at big projects, and it was predominantly used for legislative purposes, that is to say, getting Acts of Parliament in, but far more importantly, ensuring that the secondary legislation, the statutory instruments were in place. That's one of the problems that all governments face. And it would deal also with big announcements, white papers and the like. But obviously not everything went on the tracker.
Who was the custodian of the tracker?
My private office was the coordinator of the tracker, but each of the Director Generals owned their bit of the tracker.
Right. And you say each of the Director Generals owned their bit. Who owned the bit of the tracker to do with building regulations?
Oh, that would have been Peter Schofield.
Peter Schofield. And so far as you understood it, those in his team under him, would they have access?
Of course, yes. I mean, it was a two-way thing. I mean, the idea of prayers was to receive messages and to hand out messages. But I would also expect the relevant minister to also have a big say in what was. And I do understand that there was regular meetings within each directorate to make sure that when the composite tracker was available on the Wednesday morning, that everything looked okay, and they wouldn't get a difficult time for me. Not that I was ever very difficult with anybody.
Now, looking at paragraph 13 of your statement, and we'll come back to the question of the tracker later in your evidence, I think. But looking at paragraph 13 on pages 3 and 4, if we can just scroll to 4, we can see that you work with a number of junior ministers in the department, and you list them in letters A to J. You list 10 during the period 2010 to 2015. Was that a large number, a particularly large number of junior ministers for a department the size of yours in a 5-year period?
No. I mean, the average length of stay of a parliamentary secretary will probably be 18 months or so. Minister of State, probably slightly longer. Secretary of State, 3 years.
Right. How did you ensure, in general, that junior ministers acted in accordance with the strategic direction of the department as you wanted it to be?
Well, I did two things. Obviously, the prayers was a central process, but I made sure that I had a structured meeting with each junior minister at least once a month. And also, I tried to create a degree of informality. I'd often drop in and see how they were doing. Rather than, I did find sometimes the formality of the procedures rather irksome. And I preferred to go and see people rather than having them sort of drummed in to come to see me.
When you say people, you mean junior ministers?
I mean junior ministers, but I also mean Director Generals. So
right.
I wanted to try and create it was going to be a very difficult time, and obviously you want to foster teamwork. So you would try to accompany people. So for example, during the fire strikes, when they were on, we always had a minister at the department to take executive decisions. I would occasionally join them. There's no need for me to be there, but it's just a question of trying to work with people and get the best out of them.
Right. Now, just building on that answer and your approach of wanting to use a more informal direction, does that mean that you would sometimes, as it were, try to jump the species barrier between you and your private office on the one hand and the department's officials on the other?
No, would never do that, because that would undermine the private office.
Right.
I mean, I think you've had discussions about the private office, but the Secretary of State is quite different. In some respects, you have a principal private secretary, and then you have, I think I had 4 private secretaries. They would mirror and liaise closely with individual directorates, and would be talking to the Director General and talking about what things would come to me. In addition to which, obviously, I had responsibilities as a cabinet minister. I'd be on certain cabinet subcommittees, and they would shadow that process. And those occasions when I was at Cobra, they would also do that. So, as a cabinet minister, you have a responsibility beyond your department, and occasionally the Prime Minister would give me special tasks to do.
Was there a time when you felt it appropriate, as it were, to go through the door into the department and talk to Peter Schofield or any other of the more junior officials about particular matters?
I would never undermine Peter Schofield. Just as an example, I would never go below Peter Schofield to a junior official. I thought,
right,
that would have been extremely bad practice. But people would... we're talking about Peter was an exceptionally talented man, but if he wanted to see me, he would sometimes arrange with the office to pop in and see me. So it wouldn't be unusual. We started quite early and went quite late, and occasionally we'd come across him and the other Director Generals and the Permanent Secretary would occasionally meet with me in my rooms in the House of Commons, because votes need to be taken, and I physically needed to be present to do so.
Very well. We'll come back to that topic in a little bit more detail later. Just returning to the track, how did you allocate the work of the department amongst the various junior ministers at your disposal?
Well, I think you'll see on 13, I give a rough breakdown, but if we're talking as we started, I had 2 principal ministers of state. One was Grant Shapps, and he had housing and principal responsibility for local government, and the other one was Greg Clark, and he had responsibility for planning and decentralisation. Now, both these were colleagues who had been in the shadow cabinet with me when I was party chairman, and normally would have expected themselves to be secretaries of state. I tried to ensure that there was a collegiate atmosphere, not to put too fine a point that I wasn't lording over anybody,
right,
my colleagues.
Was the role of principal minister of state a formal one, or just a way of you making... No,
but it was a Minister of State. Minister of State is quite important. There's a Secretary of State, Minister of State, which is a limited number, and then parliamentary secretaries. But of course, you need to understand the coalition government. That's the formal structure, but the informal structure is that with the Liberal Democrats, they had a wider reach and a greater importance than a parliamentary secretary would normally have, because ultimately they could get decisions kicked up to the Quad, which I was always keen to avoid. And I thought I was extraordinarily lucky with Andrew and then with Don, of people who kind of understand the system.
And who was the Minister of State responsible for building regulations?
Well, this is where the informal structure comes in importance, is that it was a responsibility of the Minister of State. It may theoretically have fallen within Greg Clark, but there's a kind of understanding that that the principal contact between what was happening and what was going to be decided would be Andrew and then Don, and that if there was a problem, it would come to me, and it would be regarded as an issue we had to address. I mean, one thing that I did do, which I think was important, is I didn't caucus ever with the Conservatives by ourselves to the exclusion of the Liberal Democrats, because there needed to be a degree of trust.
Yeah. Now, we see in the list here that it's the first three, Andrew Stunnell, Don Foster, both Under Secretaries of State, and Stephen Williams, an Under Secretary of State, had responsibility, including responsibility for the building regulations. Everybody else, I think, in your list had a variety of responsibilities, including local government and housing and planning.
No. People would stand in. People would, so we wouldn't be. Andrew would reply on things relating to local government and would do debates relating to local government. When at that kind of level, you're not as confined to silos as it appears on the chart. So there is absolutely no way in which I would have put together, say, the financial settlement for local government without Andrew or Don's active participation and active agreement.
How did you decide who should have building regulations responsibilities or briefs?
It went to, the initial choice was to Andrew, because I think, as I briefly said earlier, I wanted to separate it from housing. And I suppose then both Don and then Stephen stepped into that initial decision that was made in 2010.
Now, did Andrew Stunnell have any particular experience in building regulations?
He certainly had a degree of enthusiasm.
It's not quite the same, is it?
It isn't quite the same thing. I have listened to him subsequently at various debates and now in the Lords talking about building regulations, and he certainly had a greater knowledge than I currently have. But I'm afraid the way in which the political system works is that you don't necessarily get ministers who have an in-depth knowledge of a particular subject. And if I'm being really blunt, that isn't a bad thing. A minister who thinks they know about something is actually sometimes quite dangerous. You are heavily reliant upon the officials, and there has to be a degree of trust. In fact, there has to be a high degree of trust between officials and ministers. My relationship with my permanent secretary, but I had three, but for the bulk of the period it was Bob Kersley, was an extraordinarily close one, and you relied on their judgment. You would test their judgment, you would ask them questions, but by and large, I have seen departments, I have seen ministers that were just simply at war with the civil service.
How did you ensure that junior ministers were sufficiently briefed and up to date on matters of concern to the department?
I would ensure that they had a knowledge beyond their brief through prayers and through general discussions and the tracker. In terms of their knowledge, you would see the briefing pack that they were given, and I don't think I'm giving away secrets is that their private office would report to my private office if there was a particular problem, and occasionally there were. Sometimes you'd have a minister who wasn't very good at clearing the box, clearing the letters and signatures, and sometimes you had a problem about ministers who had difficulty making decisions. Again, that was one of the reasons why the tracker was so good, because you, on big issues, you would be able to force the pace.
And you told us that you met your junior ministers once a month, at least.
At least, and the Director Generals once a month.
And the Director Generals. Were those discussions formally recorded?
No, I don't believe so.
Who did you understand during the 5-year period you were Secretary of State to have been the key official or officials within the department responsible for fire safety?
The person that I would look for would have been the Chief Fire Officer. I had two, first Ken Knight and then Peter Holland.
Were they attached to the department?
Yeah.
But attached as an official or as an exterior independent advisor?
I don't think they were independent. I thought they were. I always felt they were working for me.
Did you have any particular special advisors or SPADs who advised you about fire safety?
No. I only. We were pretty parsimonious. I only had 2 SPADs for the whole department. I think there are, I don't know, 5 now, but I would have regarded of having a SPAD to give me advice on fire, exclusively on fire, as quite a luxury.
Quite a luxury. Can you name the SPADs?
Yes. I had 2 for the whole period. The first one was Mr. Sheridan Westlake, and then I had Giles Kenningham. He stayed for a while and then went on to number 10, and Zoe Thorogood. All of these 3 people I was very familiar with. I'd worked with Sheridan probably for 10 years in various capacities. Before I was party chairman, I was deputy chairman, had responsibility for local government, and Sheridan worked with me there. Zoe was one of my media officers at Central Office, and Giles Kenningham, who went to be a media officer at number 10, also worked for me, and they were my choice.
Right. Did they ever have cause to give you any advice on fire safety or the building regulations or approved document B?
They would give me advice on work done by the appropriate officers. They would occasionally give me advice on some of the submissions would go to them.
Leaving aside the connections with local government that you've told us about already, what was your understanding about how the department's officials kept up to date with current topics, problems, controversies in the construction industry that involve the building regulations and the approved documents?
I never had cause to inquire on that. The short answer is I don't know. Right. But I think I made a reasonable assumption that they would keep abreast. And certainly, when we had various discussions, I had some real concerns about wooden framed construction, which I noticed in the bundle of documents that I looked at. So you would have discussions on and off about various things, but I can't recall any of them coming to see me and saying that there was a particular problem.
What were your concerns about wooden framed constructions?
This is about 2012. There had been a series of fires. If I'm being really honest, I saw it on television, and I made inquiries, and I can see, in preparation, I saw the sub. I can't remember the sub, but I saw the sub in preparing for this, the inquiry, and from recollection, I got assurances that there was nothing to be concerned about. And I think that is the bundle of documents which, if you don't have, I'm sure I could write to you and point that out.
Now, can we go please to page 5 of your statement, paragraph 15, and you say there, it was routine that most submissions from officials sent to junior ministers would copy in the private office of the Secretary of State.
Yeah.
My private office took decisions on a case-by-case basis as to which policy submissions were of significance and whether I needed to be consulted in addition to junior ministers. This reflects the standard and ongoing practice of delegation to ministers within Whitehall departments.
Yeah.
Now, just pausing there, is it right that you would not read every submission copied to your office, but only those which your office drew to your attention?
That is absolutely correct.
Right. And who was it in your private office that would decide which submissions you should see and which you shouldn't or wouldn't?
You may recall I gave you a brief description of the way it was organised. So if, say, something came in that related to a particular directorate that was being shadowed by one of my principal secretaries, they would make a decision, but ultimately they would contact the principal private secretary, who ultimately would make the decision. But I think as time goes on, they got used to the system, and I can't imagine there would be many debates. It was either obvious I should say it or I shouldn't. If there was a problem, I'd usually get a discreet warning.
From your PPS?
Yeah.
Right. So is the answer to the question that the decision about whether you should or shouldn't make a decision was one, in the first place, made by one of the, is this right, the 4 private secretaries, or if accelerated to the PPS, the principal private secretary, that person?
It's also a kind of a geographic thing. They sat immediately outside my office and would be working together, closer than we are sat now. So they'd be, so in a way, it was, they work things out. The SPADs, on the other hand, were entirely separate. I was very keen that the SPADs would be physically in a different place from the private office. I just felt that was, there are some things that are political and some things that aren't political, and I always felt it was important never to involve the private offices in anything that was political.
And what criteria were used by the PSs or the PPS, as the case might have been, to decide whether policy submissions were of significance such that you should see them?
I think the short answer would be experience. I think the longer answer is they would know the general direction of where we were going. They had a pretty good antenna for knowing when things were going wrong. But it did rely on the private office of the ministers also, perhaps if there was a problem, giving a warning.
And how did you, as Secretary of State, ensure that policy submissions of significance were always brought to your attention?
By instruction. It was an implicit instruction that I would see things that were important for me to see. For example, the Localism Act. Greg enjoyed an enormous degree of autonomy. He was very interested in that, but ultimately I needed to do the final sign-off, but I did it in a very collaborative way because this was massively important for the coalition. If you took, say, for example, something like troubled families, I would probably sign up most things on that because it was very complicated, it was quite controversial, and ultimately I'd be at the dispatch box having to defend it if things go wrong. Obviously, when I was seconded, for want of a better word, on flooding, there was a period when one of my colleagues required to have an operation, and then a long recuperator. I took over part of the department relating to farming and the environment. I'd be taking decisions there that normally a junior would be taking, so I'd be very hands on that kind of thing.
And how would you know if matters of significance for your decision were missed by your PPSs or your PSs or your PPS?
Well, if they were missed by the PPS, and I wouldn't know, but in government and in the world of politics, you can mess up for a while, but ultimately it comes to the service. I think also, I probably should say, is the people who work in the private office, these are the brightest of the bright. It's not like a normal civil service job. They work extraordinarily long hours for an extraordinarily long period, and it's seen as a route for promotion. Most of the directors would have worked in the private office at some time or another in a past government. So these were people, these were not administrators, these were very sensitive and clever people. And I never felt they ever let me down.
Just examining the decision-making process, however, is it also right that before a significant matter, a policy question of significance got to your office, that would have to be escalated up through the department and cleared by a senior official?
Oh, of course, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, we'll put it to one side, like for a moment, but on something like that, it would be cross-department. So you would get the opinion of the minister responsible for, say, for fire, or you get the responsibility for housing, you get the one responsible for building regs. You would get, and they would look at it, and they would give you a recommendation. So where things were, outside the individual sub-department responsibilities, that's principally when it was required. And I think by and large, they would consult me mainly, I think, on strategic issues. And occasionally, if there was somebody had messed up and said something stupid in the dispatch box, a kind of political issue, which might actually not be that important, but for the good running of the department, they would want to be able to do it, because sometimes it affected the credibility of individual ministers.
Now, two things flowing from that, Lord Pickles. First, does that tell us that there might be decisions of significance which your officials in the department would decide should not be sent to you for decision, but which you would never know about?
Yeah, of course.
Right.
I mean, by and large, everything is copied to me. So, say, for example, you get letters would come into from members of Parliament to me. I would never see them. The only people I would reply to, or the only people that would be consulted for a reply to, would be fellow cabinet ministers, chairmen of select committees, and privy councillors, and they would always get a personal letter back from me. If it was a senior member of Parliament, then the ministers of state would reply.
On the question of ministers of state, if your officials decided that there was a decision that needed to be made by you, would that necessarily always go through the junior minister or perhaps and the Minister of State before it got to your desk?
Oh, yeah.
It would?
Yeah. I mean, if it was, forgive me, just add a little bit, but obviously if it was a sudden emergency, that whole process would be truncated. But I wouldn't take a decision without having the advice of my ministers. I mean, that way, I think, would be very bad for morale and would undercut them in the same way I wouldn't have sought to undercut the Director Generals or the directors.
Was it the case that with submissions that were brought to your attention for decision, you would read them in full, or would you read only those parts which you were directed to read?
I think I'd read them in full.
And during your time as Secretary of State, did you ever have cause to think that there were matters which were not being brought to your attention?
No.
I want to turn next to the building regulations and the associated guidance. First, were you aware during your time as Secretary of State that the building regulations primarily imposed what is called a functional or performance-based requirement, or set of requirements?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I am aware of the changes that took place in the 1980s, if that's what you're referring to, about the change from prescriptive to a different regime, but I don't really understand what you're asking me.
What I'm asking you is whether you understood that the regulations didn't prescribe how to do something, they required a specific outcome.
Yeah, well, that was a change that came in the 1980s. Right. Yeah, I did understand that. Yes, right. I'm sorry, I just didn't understand what you were asking.
Now, did you become familiar at any time that you were Secretary of State with any specific functional requirement, as I call it, in the building regulations relating to fire safety?
Other than discussions with the Chief Fire Officer, I knew that a whole set of research had been commissioned following Ken Knight's work on Lacknell. I knew that it was the intention gradually to update. I knew that the research would be coming in 2015. And I knew that it was the intention to, as far as possible, to put them into plain English, so that you didn't need to be an expert to understand that was going on. I can't think of anything else that was particularly brought to my attention.
Now, that answer was compendious, and it might describe the entirety of your knowledge about this particular topic during 5 years. But let me see if I can be a bit more specific.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I'm answering to the best of my ability, and I thought I'd try and give you a comprehensive view of what it was. So I apologise.
No, so I'm not being critical. I'm just identifying the ambit of what we're doing. Can I just be a little bit more specific? Did you at any time become familiar with the specific functional requirement in the building regulations relating to fire safety, as opposed to structural safety or thermal insulation and matters of that nature?
No.
No. Were you aware of the architecture, the basic shape of the building regulations, namely that...
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Namely that they provided what I would call a functional requirement, an outcomes-based requirement, but were underpinned by statutory guidance.
Yes, I think I did. I did understand that.
You did.
I understand the lettering and the different functions.
You did.
Yeah.
Were you ever provided with any kind of introduction or briefing about the building regulations, the approved documents, and their interrelationship?
Not within the department, though I did attend a seminar on the changes as a councillor. That's a very long time ago.
Did anybody ever tell you, or did you otherwise know, perhaps, that the approved documents were no longer being reviewed and updated on a regular basis as of 2010?
Yes, that was the purpose of Andrew's principal work.
Right. Did you ever have cause to read any parts of approved document B on fire safety while you were Secretary of State?
I'm not sure. I couldn't rule it out.
Were you aware in general?
Just a minute. I think I'm so sorry. No, it's my fault. I'm sure you'll come on to this, but there was a question of whether or not document B was confusing, which went to the centre of what the coroner said, and I wasn't entirely clear what the heck that meant, and I did look at that particular section. I don't have any technical expertise, and I couldn't work out whether it was confusing or not, if I'm honest. But I'm sure we'll come on to that.
So when you read it, you didn't know whether it was confusing or not?
Exactly. I mean, I could see both sides, if I was honest, and that's why I think it was sensible. I think the coroner's views were sensible, but I'm sure we'll come on to that.
We will. But while we're on it, do you remember which part of approved document B you read?
No.
Do you remember what it was about?
No. Not after this distance, no.
No. Do you remember being aware or having any kind of familiarity, perhaps, with any guidance relating to buildings above 18 metres? Just in general terms?
Only so far as it related to sprinklers.
Right, so nothing to do with, not on external fire spread or the use of combustible materials?
No, the only would be the Lacknell and the problems with the windows.
Right. Were you ever aware of the particular dangers posed in high-rise buildings by the use of combustible materials in the external wall build-up?
No, and when I did become aware after I was Secretary of State, I found that really shocking.
And when was that?
This would be, I suppose, 2017, 2018.
Right. So after Grenfell?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right. Were you ever aware of serious high-rise fires in the UAE in 2012 or 2013?
No.
What about the Lacrosse building in Melbourne in 2014?
No, I'm afraid not. And no, neither was it brought to my attention by the relevant officers.
If anybody had used the expression ACM or polyethylene core or cladding panels between 2010 and 2015, would you have understood what they meant?
No. I don't know how relevant it is, but there wasn't a single question about cladding in the whole of the 5 years that I was Secretary of State from Parliament, which is generally a pretty good indication if there is a problem.
Right.
Nobody spoke to me about cladding, and I'll go as far as to say nobody spoke to me about cladding directly, indirectly, formally or informally.
And were you aware that your own officials had looked into the question whether a fire such as happened in Dubai in 2015 2015, high-rise buildings clad in ACM panels with a polyethylene core, could happen here in England and Wales, and had satisfied themselves, without guarantees, of course, that it could not?
No.
I want to turn next to a different topic, and we'll come back to this topic in due course when we look at Latin.
Okay.
But deregulation is where we go next. Sure. Now, can we start with Bob Ledsam's witness statement, please, at CLG 3019465, page 8. Now, you'll recall, and tell me if you don't.
It's not on my screen.
Oh, it's right. It's on ours.
Well, I'm just going to ask someone just to check.
It's on mine now.
Right.
Oh, you've got it.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
So just forgive me. What am I looking at?
Right. Let's go to page 1, and I'll show you.
Okay.
This is the witness statement of Bob Ledsam, dated 16th of November 2018, to the inquiry. Now, you'll recall, and tell me if you don't, that he was the Deputy Director with responsibility for the building regulations from June 2011 to June 2019. Now, obviously, you can't speak for anything after May 2015 in that respect, but
Yeah.
do you recall him?
I'm sure he would have been at meetings, and I hope he'll accept my apologies, but I don't remember him.
All right. Now, let's go to page 8, please, paragraph
Okay.
29. He says,
Which paragraph, sorry?
29,
Okay.
which should be on the screen in front of you. Tell me if it's not. He says there, during 2011 to
Okay. So, yeah.
during 2011 to 2017, there were two main policy influences on the department's work on the building regulations: deregulation and energy efficiency. Now, my first question is, do you agree?
I've no reason to disagree.
Right. Now, is it right that the two key deregulatory policies in operation in the years 2011, and as far as you're concerned, 2015, were the one in, one out policy and the red tape challenge?
Yes, but I can't see it's very onerous because it's not one in, one out, or two in, two out in a day or a week or a month. It was over a period. And if we were to take this entirely serious, once we'd granted local authorities general power of competence, there were so many regulations that had been gone by then, we could have regulated for months without even touching these figures.
Right. Well,
So it wasn't, I mean, I think it's kind of important to understand the difference between sort of campaigning and governing. You rightly corrected me about the various fire regulations, but I've seen in preparation for this minutes of agreement between the Minister for Government Policy and with Andrew Stunnell that any review of building regulations wouldn't touch upon matters relating to safety. So they are there, but I think I've been misleading the inquiry if I suggested that was a big factor in limiting the ability to do things.
Right. Well, let's see if we can approach it step by step.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm jumping at it myself. My apologies.
Now, is it right? The one in, one out policy was introduced on the 1st of January 2011
Yeah.
and extended to one in, two out on the 1st of January 2013.
Yeah.
And I think later, although I think you would have gone by then, March 2016, one in, three out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know whose idea this policy was?
It's not an uncommon policy. Mr. Brown had something similar in his administration, and you'll see it right across Europe and right across America. It's the idea that all governments regulate too much, and we must make a big effort to deregulate. And indeed, it is important. But I think it's really important to kind of understand that when you're in government, I never really regarded it as a binary choice.
Right.
So it isn't like you say regulation bad, deregulation good. you've always got to bear in mind what you're trying to do. And sometimes I did have concerns, and you do get concerns when people go on these kind of things, that deregulation is an end in itself, and it isn't. Deregulation is about making the situation better. I am a small state conservative, but there has to be a degree of pragmatism. There are some things that government does that need regulation.
Right. Now, just approaching the policy, is it right that the one in, one out was an administrative policy whereby no new regulation would be introduced? This is just in very broad terms. No new regulation would be introduced without a compensating reduction in regulation being made.
Over a period. I mean, it would be, I have to say, there was no political structure within the organisation that we've gone through where ministers would be asked to say, well, we want to do this on, I don't know, I don't want to be flippant, but we want to do this on ice cream vendors in exchange for doing this on fire regulations, or there was no body that would adjudicate that. It was over a period. And given we had a reputation, because there was, I suppose, some very low-hanging fruits of being a deregulating authority, the centre by and large didn't bother us very much.
Right. Now, were you always confident that your officials understood deregulation in exactly the way you've just explained it to us?
Yes, because, I mean, certainly our prayers meetings would have been very clear. I mean, you may want to talk about the exemption on fire. It looks quite polite, the minutes, but it was far from a polite experience. It was a major tussle that involved a lot more than those meetings, and quite a major triangulation of the issue from both the Liberal Democrat side, the Conservative side, and the officials. I mean, there was I think a 6 months gap from Bob's initial letter to eventually them deciding it was the case, and that was a very intense battle. So senior officials would be aware of that, and I'm sure those messages were passed down, because that was the purpose of prayers.
Was it your view that the one in, one out policy applied to approved document B? In other words, fire safety as regulated by the building regulations and the statutory guidance?
Given the minutes that I've seen of the meeting between Andrew and the Minister for Government Policy, I wouldn't have thought it would have impinged in any way on anything related to safety. That isn't to say other extremities wouldn't have been considered, but I would have been very disappointed if that was the case. And my readout that I got, Andrew started the process, Don issued the government's response, and the briefing that I got, it was clear that it didn't in any way impinge on matters relating to safety. I'm sorry if that was a bit long.
Are you referring, though, when you say it didn't impinge on matters relating to safety, to the impact or effect of the deregulatory policy on the fire safety order specifically, or on any matters, any regulation relating to fire safety?
I'm talking about two things. I'm talking about the agreement that was reached with regard for short-term fire safety, and which was between the Minister for Government Policy and Bob Neal. And I'm talking about agreements with regard to how building regulations would run, which was successfully negotiated with Andrew Stunnell. So there are two separate things, which are not quite in parallel but close.
Right, well, we'll come back to that.
Yeah, okay, fine.
We'll come back to that.
Okay.
Just to work out how it went, in general, did it work this way, that government departments proposing new regulation or guidance had to show that there was deregulation elsewhere producing an equivalent net cost to business in savings, which was twice the amount of the cost of the introduction of the new regulation?
No.
No?
No, it was over a period. Don't forget that there will always be an impact assessment, so you might get something like that.
I mean, was any account taken? Well, let me try it this way. Was the policy designed to create a metric whereby everything was reduced to a standardised economic unit and then a comparison made so that you knew what the one was going in and the one going out?
It sounds like the kind of thing that the Minister for Government Policy would really like.
Was it like that?
In practice, I have no recollection of anything like that happening. I mean, I don't want to sound disrespectful to my own government, but
that's all right.
Well, it probably is being good for me. There's a world of difference between campaigning and the reality of government. I am saying something like that didn't happen, but I cannot recall somebody wandering into my office or receiving a sub that would say, we can't do this because we can't find a bit of regulation to remove for it. I hope I don't sound dismissive, but sometimes I did get very impatient at wanting to take things to for the sake of a kind of an intellectual study rather than some of the practicalities.
Yes. Do I detect this in your answer, that actually, and I'll be colloquial if you don't mind for a moment, that the deregulatory policy had been coined as a manifesto promise to appeal to the health and safety gone mad voter contingent, and then had to be worked through an apparently scientific metric based on value for money?
Well, I think I must have, if I have to follow your colloquialism, I think I might have missed the memo on this matrix.
On the matrix, but not the first part.
That's a view you had, but
no.
It's not like it's an uncommon policy. I mean, I think the present government have got something similar. I think if you went to look at the Christian Democrats in Germany, they have something similar. For all I know, other countries in the world, everyone likes to think we're overgoverned, and indeed we are overgoverned, and indeed there was a push to try and give power locally. But was there within my department a structure which went to ministers in which we had to make decisions in terms of on a one-for-one basis, and it was 1-for-1, 2-for-1, 3-for-1, whatever. It was never an absolute. It was over a period.
What was the period?
Well, that's the great thing about the period. It was more than a month,
right.
Maybe more than 6 months. Might even have been a year.
Lord Pickles, I'm getting the impression from what you're telling us that deregulation, or if you even more specifically, 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, 2 out, was fine as a policy announcement for political reasons, but didn't actually inhibit the work that ministers felt they needed to do. Is that fair?
Yeah, I wouldn't have put it quite in those terms. I think I will put it in a way that, yes, we did want to deregulate. Yes, we did want to create a smaller scheme of things, but it wasn't a binary choice. That there was always the possibility of regulation, and we did stick to regulation. I mean, you say you'll come back to the deal we did on fire, but that was resented. and right up to almost the end of the coalition, you've taken evidence about the carbon monoxide and the smoke alarm. But even right at the last, from the centre, they were wanting to exempt small landlords, which we refused to do. I mean, we sweetened it by finding a fair chunk of money to give them out free, but nevertheless, that obligation is on. We took regulatory powers with regard to cigarettes and combustion of what they call those things that are not cigarettes. I'm so sorry, I can't remember what they're called. Vapors. There was a problem with the safety of that, and we were very kind of conscious that quite a lot of fires were caused by cigarettes and electrical faults. So we were prepared to regulate there. It isn't that we thought the deregulation was a silly idea. No, we didn't. It's a good thing to do, but it should never be just for itself. It should be about trying to achieve an aim. I think I'm happy with that description. I don't want to sound as though we were cynical. It's just it never the red tape challenge in terms of when you were wanting to regulate never got in the way, and I think that was clear from ministers. And it wasn't a cynical thing. It was just a practical thing. When you're governing, you've got to be pragmatic and deal with the situation rather than the ideology.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I hope that clarifies.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Is that a convenient moment?
Yes, it probably is, Mr. Willett. Thank you very much. Lord Pickles, as you probably know, we have a break during each session, and this is a good time to have the morning break, so we'll stop now. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 12.
Okay.
And I have to ask you, as I've asked all the other witnesses, please don't discuss your evidence or anything relating to it with anyone when you're outside the room.
Okay.
All right.
Fine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The ushers there, would you go with her, please?
I will.
Thank you, Mr. Millett. 25 to 12, please. Thank you. Would you ask Lord Pickles to come back in, please? Right, Lord Pickles, ready to carry on?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we please go back to Bob Ledsom's witness statement where we were, CLG 3019465, page 8, and have a look, please, at paragraph 29A,
Yep.
where he refers to the one-in, one-out rule, and then he says in the last sentence there was no exemption for building regulations from these rules. Do you agree with that?
No.
So he's wrong.
Because I believe so. I hesitate. This is a gentleman I'm not familiar with. But in the context of the agreement between the Minister for Government Policy and Andrew Stunnell, there was a clear understanding that matters relating to safety there'd be no concentration on. So I think they are excluded from that envelope. But it wouldn't mean that other aspects of the building regulations wouldn't be exempt. But I don't know whether I made it clear enough, and if I didn't, I'd apologise. I cannot remember a single occasion where we had to scrape round to find a regulation to scrap in order to impose a new one. The general power of competence just created an enormous gap. We could have really doubled the size. No, I don't want to sound flippant, but we could have seriously been able to do things, and I cannot understand why this would in any way be a problem. But if it was a problem and this official felt that it had to be one in, one out from building regs, then I take responsibility, because that clearly was not the intention. That senior officials knew that would not be the case. I'm sure Mr. Lebson believed what he says, and I'm sure he's not seeking to in any way mislead, and neither am I.
Well, are you able to explain how it came about that Bob Ledsom, the Deputy Director, was under the impression, which was not your impression, which was that there was no exemption for building regulations from the one-in, one-out rule?
I can't. Forgive me, because this is the only bit I've seen. Does this relate to a specific period?
Yes.
Well, by January 2013, Andrew had moved on, so he should have known that. I don't know what the point he is making, and I frankly do not understand.
Right.
Because I never found this was not something that actively we ever came across, because we had such enormous amount of credit to the deregulating ministry. A practical problem wouldn't perceive, and I would have assumed that message had reached him. But I'm not aware of ever meeting this gentleman.
You say you had an enormous amount of credit. Is it at the deregulating ministry or as it?
Sorry, I don't understand what you're saying.
Well, I didn't understand your question.
I apologize. If you ask me a question,
you said a moment ago you had an enormous amount of credit.
We had an enormous amount of credit for the centre because because of the Localism Act, which was an enormous piece of deregulation, and people generally trusted us not to drag our feet. But as I said before the break, I never regarded it as binary, and had officials come to me and said, or ministers and come to me and said, well, Secretary of State, there's a bit of a problem here. We're wanting to do things in building regulations, but the one in, one out is causing us a problem. I think I would have told them to just plough ahead.
Can I show you, please? HOM 402080. Now, this is something called a Star Chamber Internal Briefing Pack, Building Regulations. You see that? And it's dated May 2012. And if you go, please, to page 3 at the top, it says narrative, introduction, DCLG is a deregulating department. We have reduced regulation in all the areas we are responsible for, in housing and construction theme, and are looking at what more can be done. Would you agree with that statement of description of the DCLG?
This is the kind of thing I think we might have said, though I don't remember this document.
Now, why would you have said it? Why would you have said DCLG is a deregulating department if, by way of exception to that, the deregulatory agenda did not apply to the building regulations?
I don't think I said they didn't apply to. Could we be precise? I think what I said, and if I misspoke, I apologise, that matters relating to safety would not be a part of that deregulating agenda. Now, all things relating to the building regulations don't necessarily relate to safety. I hope I've been clear. And I think I've also talked about it not being a binary nature. But
well, was it generally true that the DCLG was a deregulating department, as this document says?
Yeah, by and large. But again, could I draw you back to the general power of competence and the localism agenda? Localism Act, I beg your pardon. By doing that, just by the sheer fact of doing those, an enormous numbers of regulations disappeared. The general power of competence, because rather than having to look for a specific piece of legislation in order for local authorities to be able to justify doing something, they were able to do it out of their own cognizance. And the nature is a whole raft of regulations disappeared. So it wasn't a kind of a hand-to-mouth existence of trying to find individual things to deregulate in order to regulate.
Just so I've got your understanding at the time clear, I think the Localism Act was 2011, was it?
Yeah, 2011
Yes.
Was the Localism Act, and then there's a period of about 7 months, because it was a record, of bringing in the secondary legislation. Most of that secondary legislation would have reduced what the narrative here would have recognised as deregulation.
Now, you said that as a result of that, if I got this right, the gist of it is that having got the Localism Act through, that gave you an enormous amount of credit when it came to the deregulatory policy, or those responsible for administering it.
And the second part of what I said as well, the general power of competence, which of course was part of the Localism Act, but in itself was quite significant. It actually would have given us an enormous headroom with regard to 1 in, 1 out, 2 in, 2 out, whatever.
Did that message that you had an enormous headroom with regard to 1 in, 1 out, 2 in, 2 out, as you call it, get filtered down to your officials responsible for the building regulations?
It was certainly clear at the level of which I would meet people, which would be the director and deputy director. I apologise to Mr. Lobson if I ever met him, but I'm not aware I ever did. I certainly received subs from him, but I'm not aware of meeting him. I would principally meet with the director, with the director general. That's the way the civil service operates. But I would hope that those messages will be clear.
Were you aware of the pressures that civil servants felt to deliver on the deregulating policies at the time?
That would be right across government, yeah.
Were you aware that officials in your own department felt those pressures acutely, notwithstanding the enormous amount of headroom that you had achieved through the passage of the localism bill?
I was not aware that they faced that pressure, and I can think of no real reason why they should feel that pressure.
Mr. Harrold,
forgive me, because that pressure wasn't there. I'm so sorry, I apologise for interrupting you.
Can we please look at Mr. Harrold's evidence to the inquiry, day 243, page 43. And we probably need to start at the bottom of page 42, Lord Pickles.
Is this a Q&A?
This is evidence to the inquiry from Mr. Harrold on day 243.
But sorry, I don't want to... who is he?
Right. Richard Harrold reported to Bob Leadsom from 2013.
Thank you.
Now, and he was responsible for Brian Martin.
Okay.
Just so that you've got that line in your head. Now, he says at the bottom of 242, well, there's a question at the bottom of 242 from Ms. Grange, Queen's Counsel, line 22, right, give us a flavour of what those discussions were that reinforced it, and that's about the red tape challenge. Answer, well, there was just the general, there was a general sense that regulation was bad, turnover, and even where there were proposals to do something that was regulatory in terms of introducing something that was attractive to ministers, or something they might want to do, when they recognised that it was regulation, they would pull back from that generally because that was not the way they preferred to drive change. That was his evidence. Are you able to explain?
Did he give a specific example? Because it says, could I read this bit where it says about Nick Bowles?
Yes. Of course.
So he had an informal discussion with Nick. I see that.
My question, having shown you the part I wanted to show you, was whether you were one of those ministers, or understood that you were, who was trying to drive change through deregulating, through a deregulatory agenda, and therefore acting as a disincentive to any change to the regulations, building regulations and guidance that officials wanted to make.
Well, I'm not sure why Nick is having this this discussion, but the short answer is, of course, I wanted to deregulate. I mean, would it be helpful if I went through the process that would have happened if we wanted to regulate? Because I will be asked a number of questions from the centre, and I don't mean this in any way in a pejorative sense, but to regulate, it's not like we're in the court of Henry VIII. To regulate or to put things through Parliament is a very chancy and difficult thing to achieve. I'll go through that if you want, but just to say, the questions that will be asked of me is, why does the present system not work? What attempts have you made to change the present system? Why would only regulation work? Isn't there another way of powers that we already have to deal with to do that? Now, these were common questions, and I don't see that kind of structure in that kind of discussion. And I don't think a kind of an informal chat, as opposed to, we've got a problem, we need to sort this out, we can't do it any other way, which is the kind of thing that you would see when we did decide to regulate. That's the kind of the flavour of the sub we would have got on carbon monoxide alarms or on smoke alarms. You had to go through a process, and I don't think that is a bad process to go through. But, and I mean, I don't mean this rudely to the gentleman, but I think a kind of little informal chat in a minister's office is not, to my way of thinking, really properly exploring a government policy. But I haven't read the whole of it, so I may be jumping to the wrong conclusion.
Well, I'm just showing you a portion of quite a lot of the evidence that we heard from a number of officials in the department at the time on this precise topic.
Yeah.
And I will be looking at others in a moment,
Yeah.
so I am going to repeat the question.
That's okay.
But were you aware that officials felt during the period, certainly from 2011 to the end of your time in May 2015, that they were working in a policy environment where regulatory intervention was a last resort?
Well, that isn't a bad thing, is it?
Is that a yes?
It would be no. That is not a yes. It would not be, that would not be a bad thing. What would be a bad thing is if we say we're not going to regulate no matter what case you put up. That would be bad. But to have a system where, say, we're not going to jump straight into regulation, that strikes me as being a good thing. I hope I'm clear on that point.
Were you aware that officials were working in a policy environment whereby regulatory intervention in matters of fire safety and so life safety was a last resort?
No, and that shouldn't be, given that's the agreement that we'd reached, that's the agreement that had been put together by Bob Neal. I mean, it was quite a live and important topic, and certainly by that time it had been resolved, and I can't believe anybody involved in the service would not have gone through 6 months of very intensive lobbying of government, at which officials were used, the Liberal Democrats were used, and the Conservatives were used, and I was personally involved in. I mean, that was a very big change, and by no means certain that we would get it. It was a whole 6 months of very difficult negotiations. If you felt it would be helpful, I could take you through it, but if not, I'm happy to move on.
Well, I'm just really seeking to understand how it could come about that the officials in the department felt they were working in a particular environment. Let me show you another piece of evidence while we have this transcript up on the screen. Can we please go to page 102 and look at lines 19 to 20 there? This is, again, part of Richard Harrell's evidence, and he said at line 16, we can pick it up, I think. In the case of our division, the process for amending or changing regulation was becoming so onerous that we were working hand to mouth to try to cover the scope and ground that we needed to. Now, that was his evidence.
And does he give an example?
Well, it's a general comment he's making in response to a question, but that's his evidence. And are you able to say whether you can agree with it, disagree with it, or justify it, or say whether it's unjustified?
Could I crave your indulgence and see the question?
Yes, of course. Can we go back to page 242? And you'll pick it up at line 14.
Okay,
it's in the context of the recommendations made by the Lack
of short answer saying that simply we wouldn't have time for someone to sit down and spend some time capturing the problems. And could you go back to the point you were...
Yes, can we go to page 102? Yeah, very large and complex at the top of the page.
Good Lord. No, I can't explain that. It seems to me a bit extraordinary. For getting on to Lucknow, I was assured that things were progressing, assured repeatedly. But I had made an assumption that most of that work would be taking place at the back end of 2015 and moving into 2016 and 17. I thought I ran the department reasonably, and that people could tell me when things were going wrong. In fact, you know, I asked my private office and the larger conglomerate of Director Generals, I really only had two things I wanted from them. I always gave the same speech, which was loyalty and tell me when things were going wrong. And I promised that I would not seek to blame them if things were going wrong. I'd try and sort it out. And I think I can say that I succeeded in doing that. I had taken over from people who shouted at officers, who threw things about. I can safely say I never raised my voice to a single officer in the whole of those 5 years. So there just seemed to me a way in which that should have been properly put up to the minister or to me. I mean, the minister, after all, has got a vested interest in delivering all this. They are ambitious people. They want to succeed. And you know, I thought I would have heard about this, but it's a matter of some grief to me that they didn't.
Well, we'll come back to some more of that in a moment, but let's then look at the red tape challenge. Now,
Okay.
Am I right that was launched in 2011?
I think that's probably about right.
Yes, and I think was still in place when you left post.
I think so, and I think there's a variation of it going on now, and I think there was a variation of it before we arrived.
And am I right in thinking it was a cross-government policy designed to essentially crowdsource the views from businesses, organisations and the public on which regulations should be retained, scrapped or improved?
Yeah.
Yes. Now, the word challenge there, was this in relation to departments competing with each other?
I think I'll answer it in two parts. I think, strictly speaking, the challenge related for the public to challenge the regulatory environment, and that was it. But I will be misleading you if there wasn't a degree of what might be described as sibling rivalry between various government departments. I'm sure that is the case. But the challenge does relate to the public.
The challenge is to the public?
The challenge is from the public to us.
I see. Right. So the public would challenge government.
Yeah.
I follow. Now let's go then to the question about competition. INQ 30151133. This is a document published by the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills in December 2014. So during your time as Minister or as Secretary of State, and it's called the 9th Statement of New Regulation, Better Regulation Executive. And if we go to page 8 there, we can see a table, headed Table 2, Departmental Regulation and Deregulation from January 2011 to July 2015. And if we look at the second department down on the left, we can see your department, Department for Communities and Local Government. And if we go along the table, we can see that your department made a net saving to business over the Parliament of £201 million.
Wow.
So then let's go to page 10. You say, wow. Did you not know that?
Well, we're talking about getting things quite close. Oh, just a minute. It says regulation and deregulation from January 2011 to July 2015. By July, I've been sacked.
Well, this is a December 2014, so there's an element of, presumably an element of projection in here. But that's the period in the document. Did you ever see this document at the time, do you think?
No, I'm not aware of it.
Right. Let's go to page 10. We can see there the league tables. Table 3, Departmental Net Regulation from January 2011 to July 2015. And there's a ranking, as you can see, and it shades from green, a bright green, to a more insipid green down at Cabinet Office level.
Wow, yeah.
And then a pale Food Standards Agency, and then pink Ministry of Justice, and then increasingly red till you get to the Treasury at the bottom of the league table, 14th. And you can see that your department comes fourth with a net regulation saving of £201.52 million. Now, does that tell us that there was competition between departments for top spot?
No. And anybody that knows anything about government would tell you we were enormous. We were an enormous department, close to a quarter to a third of public expenditure. So I wouldn't have said this, but for us to save £201 million wouldn't have been that hard. I mean, the Treasury, I suppose it's nice to poke fun at the Treasury, but the Treasury is a tiny department. So it'd be quite interesting to see a comparison against total budget. I mean, look at the Department of Work and Pensions and Health and Safety Executive. I mean, that is just enormous. I mean, there are some states in the former EU that wouldn't have a budget even approaching that. So for them to make those kind of savings necessarily wouldn't be that hard. But you take somewhere like, say, the Food Standard Agency, or even better, the Ministry of Justice, which is minute, the Cabinet Office, which barely has any real big function and doesn't really do very much by way of employment. And look at the size of the Education Department. So I kind of understand why these things come out. I'm no longer an active politician, so forgive me if I have a rather jaundiced view about this, but I'd be interested to see a projection against total budget and as a percentage of total budget. I hope that is helpful.
Yeah. Did anybody ever sit down and work out how much this exercise cost, regulating, deregulation, reviewing the results, putting together a league table like this?
I don't know, but I hope they had a good time doing it.
Right. Was this the sort of thing that you as Secretary of State were in charge of driving forward, so far as your department, in fourth place?
Yes, but I if there was a cup to get, it would be nice, but I'm not entirely sure how justified that would be. I'm just trying to help the inquiry. This is not cynical, but I think you need to kind of understand how sometimes these things that people put out a puff piece don't necessarily match the reality.
Right. I mean, you call it a puff piece. I mean, it's a document from the Minister of State for Business, Enterprise and Energy, who at the time was the Right Honourable Matthew Hancock MP.
I withdraw the remark puff piece. It was entirely unjustified, and I regret using it.
That may be a matter for the panel. But let me ask you this. Stephen Williams, who gave evidence earlier this week, told us, and for reference purposes, it's day 259, page 8, lines 17 to 18, that you were keen to please the Treasury.
Yeah.
Was that a fair observation?
Any ambitious Secretary of State wouldn't want the Treasury as an enemy. It is a government within government. But I saw Stephen's evidence. But yes, I mean, I didn't go out of my way to antagonise the Treasury, though I did personally antagonise, I think, the Chancellor on a number of occasions.
How important was it that your department made financial savings under the red tape challenge?
Not as important as the financial savings within the general envelope of the economic position. We came in at a very difficult time, famously, where the Chief Secretary said all the money was gone. So in terms of the kind of money that had to be saved, these are relatively small sums compared to the amount of money that came out of the revenue support grant, or even the capital programme, which was in a very difficult position the first few years.
Mr. Millett, just so that we understand correctly this table we're looking at, would it be right to read it as identifying the net saving to business or to the country at large flowing from deregulation by these departments rather than cutting costs of the department?
Yes. It would. I mean, I haven't shown the witness the full statement. It's long, but yeah, the answer is yes. It's a league table of savings made from deregulation, and you get that. Perhaps it may help.
But the point, the savings here are calculated to be savings to the public at large.
Yes.
Or business or whoever's going to.
It's really a question for the witness, but let me show you page 9. So sorry, if we can go back a page. This is what Mr. Hancock sets out as Annex C, the ins and outs for each department that make up the totals above, and the totals above are in the table I showed you before. And there's some detail about what they don't include, 19 outs that haven't yet been validated. Unvalidated regulatory measures on the fast-track process are included in the account of £1 million each, agreed by the RPC as the maximum cost for measures. The table below shows the department's net savings over the Parliament in the form of a league table. And one gets a bit more of the flavour of it, Mr. Chairman, from the rest of the report, but the answer is yes.
And we can see on this page the heading, as part of the heading, equivalent net cost of business.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
And I think I think the point I'm making is that if you've got an enormous budget, enormous responsibility, by the nature of you doing anything, the savings are likely to be rather large. But if you were in a position like the Food Agency, which is relatively small, what they achieved might have been much more impressive in real terms than what we achieved. I mean, this is kind of difficult for me because, I mean, normally you kind of sent out to make a political view, but my view is I've got to be as helpful as I can, and I've got to tell you what the reality is rather than sometimes the fantasy of government is.
Leave aside the usefulness or otherwise of the league table. Were there specific targets for these kinds of savings, equivalent net cost to business, that you had to meet as a department?
Well, I was the strategic head of the department, and most policy flowed from me. I'm not aware of this document, and I can't say I'm aware of any sort of scrabbling around to make savings or to produce something for it. I mean, it's possible it happened at a lower level to me, but this is the first time I've seen this document. I mean, I'll certainly look at it when I leave the inquiry. But I have to say, sometimes when you see statistics, you need to see them into some kind of context.
Now, let's move to your statement, please.
Okay.
Page 8, paragraph 30. And this is under the heading, excluding fire safety from deregulation reviews. You see that?
Yes, I can now.
Yes. Good. And at page 8, paragraph 30, you say this, and I'll read it all to you. One of the priorities of the coalition agreement was the streamlining of regulation through the red tape challenge review. The department was responsible for the regulatory reform Fire Safety Order 2005, the FSO, and it was strongly felt that the challenge should not be applied to the FSO, and so I took steps explicitly to exempt the FSO from the scope of the initiative. This was for a number of reasons. Firstly, the matters covered by the order included safety requirements that had the potential to affect life and death. It was clearly right that there should be legislative provisions to govern such matters. Secondly, the order's regime was itself the product of a very substantial and prolonged deregulation exercise under the previous government, leading to many legislative provisions being repealed and a streamlined content being contained within the order. After prolonged discussions, including Fire Minister Bob Neal writing to Oliver Letwin, Cabinet Minister for Government Policy on 15th June 2011, and follow-up at official level, the Cabinet Office agreed in December 2011 that the FSA would be excluded from the red tape challenge. My department was quite forceful in ensuring that this happened. Now, this touches upon some of the answers that you've given earlier this morning, but it's right to think, isn't it, that the FSA regime had effectively already been through what you might call a red tape challenge during a deregulation exercise under the Blair government?
Sure. And as I said, that I think it might have. Yes, it probably was. Might have been Brown by that time. I'm not sure, but yes, it had been through a process. But I mean, this comes back to the question of what you do when you're in government. It seemed to me that it hadn't been in place for that long. It needed to be bedded down. It seemed to be reasonably settled. The advice that we were getting from the sector through the chief fire officers, that people were generally very happy with it. And it just seemed to me that it would be pointless going through something again for the sake of intellectual consistency. I would also say my newfound frankness. I was pretty sure at the end of the process, had we gone through this, one, there would have been an enormous row. Two, it would have been disruptive to the service. And three, you wouldn't have done anything in the end. So it struck me that it was needed to be done. But getting us from that position did require an enormous amount of work and a proper sort of triangulation of the problem. And it looks very polite, but it wasn't even vaguely polite.
Right. Polite or not, it's right to think, isn't it, that the exemption that you've described in that paragraph was temporary, wasn't it, with an expectation that it would be considered again at some point in the future?
No, I've seen the thing. It was suggested that in 2016, when it would have been embedded for 10 years, we might have a relook. But when you get a government to essentially do a kind of a U-turn on what is regarded as an important policy, you must always ensure that you save face with the people that you've persuaded to do the U-turn. And I think the letter which you'll see in the, I've seen in the bundle, you will see where it explicitly talks about relooking at 2016 was to be able to come to an agreement with a degree of dignity on both sides. However, I have to tell you that when I left office, we'd made no attempts to start to look at fire, and we would have had to have laid plans to do it in 2016, in 2015.
Now, leaving aside the FSO, which is what you've referred to in this paragraph, although the heading of this part of your statement is excluding fire safety, you only refer to the FSO, but we
Yes.
see nothing here about the building regulations or approved document B. Why is that?
I can't answer you why it wasn't included, but what I can say is what we did, which I referred to earlier this morning, which was, and I've seen it in the documentation. It's there for you to see, that we came to an understanding that when we looked at building regulations, that things like safety would not be a priority, and you don't need to sort of kind of take my aspirations on this. The consultation went out by Andrew Stunnell by the time in which the government had, by the time in which the government had to respond. Don had taken over, and part of that was that actually we hadn't impinged upon safety at all. I mean, I'll happily wait if you want to bring that up.
Well, are you saying that there's a document which enshrined an agreement?
Yeah, I've seen
that
it. I've seen a readout of a meeting. I've seen that.
Right. I think I know what you're talking about. We may come back to that in due
Okay,
course.
that's good.
But was it your understanding that approved document B was exempted from the red tape challenge?
Forgive me, you asked me that question before the break, and I corrected you on that. And I said that it was that we would prioritise and ensure that safety wasn't involved, but of course, other aspects of the document would be subject to, and this is about building regulations generally. You will also see in those documents a discussion with the Education Ministry concerning noise in schools and whether or not it will be appropriate to fold that from the building regulations in. So yes, we were doing all those kinds of things, but the question that you asked me before the break, I think I'm consistent in my answer.
Well, I'm sure it's my fault, Lord Pickles, but I'm not.
Well, it could be my fault. I mean, you know.
Well, let me ask the question again and see if I can understand it. Was it your understanding during the time that you were Secretary of State that approved document B, which is one of the parts of the statutory guidance documents under the building regulations dealing with fire safety, was exempted from the red tape challenge?
No, I'll repeat my answer that those matters that related to safety would not be touched. That we were looking for rationalisation in the process of B, but in particular with B, what the information that I was given before Lacknall House was that we were going to be going through the process of the building regulations, of which B would be part of which we would try and ensure that they were more understandable. I was told in order to achieve that, a whole series of research had been put together, which would be ready for 2015, and then the serious work would start in terms of that rationalisation. This was before Lacknall. We received the Lacknall letter, and it played into that. I hope that's clear now.
Well, when you say no, it related to safety, what do you mean by safety?
I mean things that relate to safety, that threatens life.
Threatens life.
Yeah.
Were you aware that something like 70% of the building regulations is about life safety?
Yeah, that would seem.
Approved document B.
I would not demur from that whatsoever, and therefore it would have enjoyed a high level of protection.
Right. When you say it would have enjoyed a high level of protection, were you absolutely clear that it was clear to all the officials that approved document B, which is all about life safety, and any other aspect of the building regulations themselves about life safety were clearly exempt from the red tape challenge?
Well, the top team that helped Andrew negotiate this would have been actively involved, and Andrew was a very talented guy, but I can't believe he would have achieved this without help from people doing this at a level, as I suppose, I don't know, level 7 or that kind of thing, people that would not be part of the top team. I can't believe that wasn't achievable. I do understand that, I mean, we can go on to this if you desire, that there was always continuous pushback from the centre. But the message from the top team was clear. I don't have the ability to be able to deal with junior ranked officers. I expect the process of that kind of message to be taken care of by officials. These are people that I never met. It's not that I was too snooty or I didn't want to meet them, but at my level, these are people that I would not normally meet. I would only meet the Director Generals and the directors.
Are you aware of any document by way of guidance, protocol, policy statement, strategy document, or anything like that, which you knew was in the hands of your top officials, which clearly delineated and exempted fire safety in the building regulations and statutory guidance from the red tape challenge, or the other deregulatory agendas?
Yeah, I have no memory of it. All I have is a recovery of memory, having seen that document within the selection of documents I looked in order to prepare here.
Right. The difficulty I've got, Lord Pickles, standing here is that I have to guess what document it is you're referring to, and I don't want to do that. So maybe we'll have a think and come back to you.
That's okay.
At some point during the day. But let's park that then for the moment. Now, I want to show you what Bob Leadsom said in his evidence about applying for exemptions. First question before I do: does it surprise you that no exemptions for the life safety parts of the building regulations or the statutory guidance were ever even considered by the building regulations division within the department?
I don't find it surprising. I find it astounding.
Right. Now let's see what Bob Leadsom said in his evidence about this. Day 241, please, page 76. And at line 7, I asked the question as follows of Bob Leadsom: do you remember, did you or anybody else in your department ever consider even trying to apply for an exemption for the building regulations or the approved documents? Answer: no. Question: and why was that? Answer: frankly, I don't think we would have got one. And frankly, there's a judgment which you make in this state as to whether is it a fight worth having.
Oh.
Now, what's your reaction to that, apart from the
Intense impatience. I just find that. No, I don't want to. This is someone I don't want to condemn in any way. But what's the point in holding that kind of job if you don't let those? My view might be put simply: it was politicians' role to take decisions. You don't help the politician to take a decision unless you confront them with the reality. Now, you showed me something a few moments ago with a conversation with Nick Bowles, which looked rather informal, I have to say. But if I was doing this job, if it was me and I had the captain, I would make sure that we faced up to reality. If this reality is that we need to regulate, or there is a problem, then it is appropriate for them to speak to their higher line management. I don't know in any of this whether they spoke to their higher line management. And when they've spoken to their high management, for that management to take it forward.
Now, going on in his evidence, and I'm not going to read it all out to you, but it is, for our purposes, pages 76, line 15 to 80, line 13. I'm summarising, I hope, accurately. He said he didn't even think to ask for an exemption from the building regulations or approved documents, because first he would have to go to you, and you in turn would have to make a case to your opposite number Secretary of State within the BEIS, whose department was responsible for these decisions, and the net annual equivalent cost to business was the key deciding metric, not life safety. I've summarised his evidence. Do you agree with that?
But that's my job. I mean, the process of being Secretary of State is between colleagues, is to deliver this kind of thing. There's an enormous amount of horse trading that would go on. But again, I repeat the point. It's the responsibility of politicians to take decisions. You're not giving. These didn't help us by not facing up to the reality. I would have expected that to go up through line management, and I would have expected to have a discussion. I would have expected the permanent secretary to come and say, I think we've got a bit of a problem here, we need to do something about it. Now, I aren't saying that I would have agreed with, is this still Mr. Lebson?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not saying I would have agreed with Mr. Lebson, but I think I'm entitled to have had a chance to do the right thing or do the stupid thing.
Did you know that officials within the Building Regulations Division were operating under an assumption that the deregulation policy, whether it's 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, 2 out, or the red tape challenge, would also catch even a clarifying amendment to the statutory guidance in support of the building regulations?
No. I can definitely answer that. Well, no, I didn't. And I would have regarded it as being ludicrous and wholly disproportionate.
Were you aware, and I suspect the answer flowing from your last answer is no, but correct me if I'm wrong about that officials were working on the basis that any change to the guidance in the approved documents supporting the building regulations needed to be the subject of a regulatory impact assessment because there would be a potential cost to industry of simply reading the new guidance?
No, Richard, to the best of my knowledge, you wouldn't do that on individual things. It would be against the whole document. It's quite expensive to do that. I got used to seeing regulatory assessments, and we extended them, put them out on an awful lot of things. But no, that seems to me to be
right,
wholly wrong. And well, forgive me for saying this, I don't find it very convincing.
Well, that's, with great respect, not a matter for you.
It isn't a matter for it's a matter for this thing, but I think I am entitled to my views.
Did you understand at the time that it was envisaged that the government's deregulatory policies would apply with full vigour to parts of the building regulations which were concerned with light safety?
No.
No. Do you know whether there were any checks and balances in place, so far as you understood the position, to ensure that life safety was not unacceptably compromised by these deregulatory policies?
There wouldn't have been any point in exempting fire if we went through a back way and achieved the same kind of disruption that I was seeking to avoid to have achieved this. This is entirely contrary to what I would have wanted. It is entirely contrary to what I would have dealt with had I known. I find this incredible evidence.
Were there any policies in place to ensure that departments such as yours observe their obligations to safeguard life, including under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and were properly prioritised?
I can't think of anything that brings to mind, but I would hope that that would be the case. I mean, that's the very nature of government. We're there to protect citizens, not to make life difficult for them or to put them at risk.
Yes, as a broad statement that people might find that self-evident, but my question is a functional one. Were there, in fact, any positive policies in place at the time to ensure that departments such as yours discharged their obligations to protect life, including under Article 2?
I'm not aware of anything, but I'm not aware of anything that didn't exist. I have no recollection what that situation is. I cannot recall any occasion where I was asked to make that kind of judgment.
I mean, some people might think that it was so obvious that it went without saying, but were you at the time of the view that it was so obvious that it went without saying in respect of fire safety, and particularly the approved documents supporting the building regulations?
Given what we'd gone through to ensure that the changes that were taking place with that initial review, that Andrew Snell started and Don Foster finished, I think that will be correct. Given that I was expecting the major change in document B to take place after 2015, when the research was taking place, I think the short answer is yes, I would have made that assumption.
Well, let's look at that activity, the review, which took place, I think, between 2011 and 2013. Do you recall, this was announced by Andrew Stunnell, who at the time was...
I think I've just said that.
Yes, and he set out the programme of works, I think, in December 2010 to Parliament. Did you remember authorising that?
I knew it was happening. I may or may not technically have authorised it.
Do you recall that the bulk of that programme was deregulatory in nature?
Yes, I think it was.
Yes. And that's certainly what he told Parliament on the 16th of December 2010. Yeah. And do you remember that he said to Parliament that part of the deregulatory element was in order to reduce burdens on the building control system, but also to look at compliance with the building regulations and reasons for non-compliance?
I don't hear anything that I would have objected to.
Right. Would you remember that that was what he said?
No, I don't remember that is what he said. I have no recollection whatsoever of this. It's a long time ago, and I don't remember him saying that. I think I need to be accurate. I don't doubt he said it. It sounds very reasonable, and I think I would have agreed with it.
Right. Can you tell us how your department was seeking to reduce burdens on building control officers?
No, I couldn't. Not at my level.
Right.
At my level, it would not come anywhere near me.
And therefore, is it right, at your level, you didn't know how your department was taking steps to ensure that reducing burdens on building control officers did not adversely affect protections of life safety?
I would expect my minister and my officials to warn me if that was the case.
And do you know how your department monitored whether the enforcement of building regulations by building control officers was adequate?
No. But forgive me, can I just add a little thing to that? At no time did anybody raise with me that there was any problem with that.
Right. Did you? Can you tell us whether your department learned anything particular one way or the other about compliance, whether it was good, bad, average?
If it did, I cannot recall it reporting back to me. That isn't to say that it might not have done, but I have no recollection of that at all.
Did you at any time during the building regulations deregulation review, Andrew Stunnell's review, finishing in 2013, conduct any in-depth review of technical standards required by the building regulations, or have that done?
Well, I hope that happened, but not at my level.
Right.
This is not something that would ever have come to me.
Not in detail necessarily, but let me ask it slightly differently. To your knowledge, did the department conduct an in-depth review of technical standards required by the building regulations?
I can't recall anybody talking to me about it. That isn't to say that it didn't happen, but I have no recollection of that occurring. It does sound to me to be something that might sensibly be done. Can
I invite you to go back then with me to Bob Ledsam's statement, CLG 3019465, page 10, paragraph 34. He says here...
Stop, I haven't got 34. Yes, I have now, sorry. I beg your pardon.
He says here, this led, and that's the programme we've discussed already, this led to the 2011 to 13 review of building regulations. The review was a comprehensive exercise in terms of coverage, but did not involve an in-depth review of all of the technical standards. The aim was to identify, quotes, quick wins, unquotes, for deregulation and system improvement. Is that correct?
If it was, I wasn't aware of it.
Right.
I mean, bearing in mind what I talked about, the informal power structure and the importance of the Liberal Democrats, I didn't go out of my way to interfere in what Andrew wanted to do.
Were you, right, would you align yourself with that policy aim, namely to identify quick wins for regulation?
Well, it depends. If that went side by side with doing something substantial, I might. But I can't see the point of quick wins unless you have no objective in mind.
Suggest quick wins might be short, simple, cheap deregulation, which had a high saving in the annual net cost savings to business.
Well, I mean, that's one definition, but I don't know if there was something substantial that was happening in parallel.
As a result of the review, do you remember, did anybody in your technical policy team bring to your attention any emerging problems or disputes or controversies where the regulation or guidance needed to be updated or amended?
The technical team would not speak to me, but they would go to their line manager, who would eventually talk to the Director General, or possibly even at Director level, and they would inform me of that.
Did they?
I am not aware of that. I don't believe that to be the case.
Are you familiar with something called the 7 work streams, or the 7 areas where research was required, which eventually produced 7 reports?
These are ones that reported in February 2015.
Yes.
I knew they were happening, but I didn't know the details. This was something that I think came out of Ken Knight's review of Lacknell. I was told that they were essential in order to amend approved document B.
Who told you that? Do you remember?
Yes, Ken told me that. Also, Sir Bob told me that. And I think I had it repeated by Peter. And I think I've also seen it in the documents that I looked at in order to prepare for these hearings.
And what did the 2011 to 2013 review end with? Was there a report or document?
Yes, there was a document. Yes, I think Don produced a document.
Now I want to turn next to the Fire Futures review.
Okay.
And we'll come back possibly to deregulation later. But
okay.
It starts with CLG 30194171. And this is your statement, page 5, paragraph 16, where under the heading Departmental Priorities and Fire Governance under the Coalition, you say this. In July 2010, Bob Neal MP, as Minister responsible for fire safety, announced the Fire Futures Review. Now, first, did you play any part in commissioning that review?
Well, it couldn't have been. They required my permission to do it. It seemed a reasonable thing to do. We were wanting to make a number of changes that reflected where fire was going, fire and rescue services were going.
Which was what?
Well, there'd been a general reduction in the number of domestic fires, but there'd also been a big increase in what you might call car accidents and civil contingencies. It's acutely aware that firefighters have played a very important part in dealing with 7/7. We seem to be moving into a world where that kind of thing was more likely. It was a trend that we were seeing in other European nations, and we thought it would be good to do with the review. There were also some problems with regard to duplication and problems of procurement and inoperability.
Now you say at paragraph 18 that the Fire Futures Review, which took the form of 4 reports, was published in December 2010, and the government's response to it was published on 12th of April 2011.
Yeah.
Did you read the reports when they were published?
Yes, I'm sure I did. I would certainly have read the executive summary, but I don't recall them being that large. But I don't think at this stage I'd be able to run any detailed consideration after the period of years.
Let's look at FSF 6037. This is entitled Decentralisation in the Fire Sector, Empowering and Protecting the Citizen. Workstream Chair Brian Robinson's President, Association for Specialist Fire Protection. And this was one of the reports published in December 2010. Can we go to page 10, please, and look at the 4th paragraph down on the left-hand side, and let's have that blown up for you.
That's the regulatory framework, or is that the currently...
The next one. There is currently a perceived low level. And it says, there is currently a perceived low level of competency within the sector in relation to fire safety and built environment, not helped by the fact that there is no common qualifications framework that covers building and fire safety competencies. Whilst the FRS undertakes building safety checks, no single organisation can take on responsibility for awareness of fire safety amongst building designers, constructors, owners and occupiers. This campaign can be taken on by that part of Fire UK, normally referred to as the industry. That part of the sector needs to come together more closely and be less introspective, and there must be a much better dialogue, in particular with those outside the core specialist fire safety sector who are not fire specialists, but who in practice are responsible for delivering fire safety in practice, e.g. general design, specification and construction owners. Do you remember reading that at the time?
I don't remember reading that at the time, but it looks reasonable.
Were you aware of those concerns in general terms, even though you may not have read this at the time?
I can't recall. I'm sorry, this is important, and forgive me, but I genuinely don't remember this.
Were you, in even more general terms, aware that one of these 4 reports had raised concerns about levels of competence among those working in fire safety and the built environment?
I don't recall.
Was that not something that you should have known?
It might be that I knew at the time, but you asked me if I recalled it, and I don't recall it. I mean, I can only answer honestly. It's been a long time, and I don't remember this. But again, this level of detail is not something that would normally come to me. That's what the Fire Minister is there for.
Yes, but would it not have been your responsibility to know the point that this paragraph is making?
I'm not sure it would be. It would be my responsibility when a form of work was being put together in order to address this, yes.
Would it not also have been your responsibility to know in outline or bullet point terms at least the output, including this paragraph?
I didn't hear that question, I'm sorry.
Would it not have been your responsibility also to know, at least in outline, the output of the work, including the point being made in this paragraph?
What do you mean output?
Result. Outcome.
I would expect the outcome to be reported to me, yes.
Yes. Now, can we go back to your statement, please? Page 5, paragraph 18, where we see, and I've read this to you, that the government's response was published on the 12th of April 2011. Did you have any involvement in drafting the response?
I have no recollection of this at all.
Let me show you the document.
I mean, I may have, but I have no recollection of it.
No, fair enough. Let me show you the document. It might help. HOM 3045999. Let's look at that. That's the response, government response. The first page is not terribly informative. But if we go down to page 2, we can see that it's published in April 2011, as you can see from the foot of the screen. And if you go to page 3, you can see the contents, introduction by Bob Neal, the context, community-focused fire and rescue service, conclusion, and then annex, summary of fire futures ideas. And does that list of contents ring a bell with you?
It's not unfamiliar, but it doesn't bring with me any detailed knowledge of the report. I recognise the fire service college, and I recall that we took action on that. I noticed the cross-sector collaboration, and we were very, very keen to see that happen between the blue light services. And I see local and national resilience, and I think that was one of the things that we regarded as being very important, plus local decision-making.
Did you read this response when it was published in April 2011?
I think I will have done.
Right. Now, can we go to page 10, then? Paragraph 18 of the report. It says this is under the heading cross-sector collaboration. The sector has already begun to show leadership in this area and can build on initiatives such as, and then if you look at the third bullet point down, the work of the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council, which is developing an agreed competency standard for those offering commercial fire risk assessment services. Just pausing there.
I can't see that. Could you just tell me where that is? Oh, sorry, I've just got to see it. It's the last third point, yeah.
Yes.
Do you let me read it, please?
Yes, the work of the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council, which is developing an agreed competency standard for those offering commercial fire risk assessment services. Now, just on that, were you aware at the time of the work, the general work of the Competency Council?
No.
Were you aware at the time that council, the department, your department, had conducted a review in March 2009 on the effectiveness of the RRO, the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005?
No.
Were you aware that Ken Knight, I think you are, or were, had produced a report in July 2009 on the fire at Lacknell House?
Yes.
Yes. Let's go to that then. HOM 401092, page 11. There's a heading. To be fair to you and those looking, let's go to page 1 just to identify the report itself. There it is. It's the report from Sir Ken Knight, dated the 30th of July 2009. Sir Ken was asked about it when he came to give evidence at this module of this inquiry.
Okay.
And if we go to page 11 in this, which is where I wanted to go with you, paragraph 7, under the heading Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005, Emerging Issues, there is a requirement under the Fire Safety Order to appoint one or more competent persons to assist the responsible person in undertaking the preventable and protective fire safety measures within premises. However, there is no similar requirement for a competent person to be appointed to assist in making a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. It is important that assurance be given to both the responsible person for the premises and the enforcing authority that a risk assessment has been undertaken by a competent person, particularly in relation to high-risk premises. Were you aware, when you read this report, as you tell us you did, of a concern about risk assessments not being undertaken by a competent person, particularly in relation to high-risk premises?
Forgive me, I don't think I said... This is the 2009?
Yes.
Oh, no, I didn't read this, the 2009. I was aware of it, but I didn't, this was before we came into office. I mean, Ken took me through it.
Right.
But by way of a conversation in terms of the things that we needed to do, I cannot remember whether he referred to this or not. But what I can say, is to be frank, is this kind of detail is not the kind of detail that a Secretary of State would look at. This is a decision for a junior minister to move forward.
Let's take it in stages, if we may.
Okay.
Pickles, you say, you told us before this morning, that Sir Ken had taken you through this report.
No. That Ken had taken me through the current issues at which he mentioned the report. He didn't take me through it page by page. That would be quite wrong to suggest that.
I'm so sorry. I understood your answer just a moment ago, and you said, I mean, Ken took me through it, that you went through the report.
No. Ken took me through the issues. I apologise. I should be a little bit more formal in what I'm saying. Sir Ken took me through some contemporary issues that we're looking at. He mentioned the stream of research that was taking place, and he also said that the time was right to start looking at some changes within the fire service to match the reality on the ground.
What were the circumstances in which Sir Ken Knight took you through the issues on which he had reported in 2009?
I can't remember in detail, but it was by way of a discussion, just bringing me up to date, in the same way in which I would meet with the Director Generals. I'd meet with Ken and later with Peter. I mean, there were some times in my period as Secretary of State that I would see Ken or Peter every day of the week, including Sundays, for long and protracted periods. So this was somebody I was very familiar with. So having a conversation with Ken or with Peter was not something that was special that you would remember, because they were a constant companion at specific times when I was Secretary of State over the 5 years.
What was it about the role you had and the role Sir Ken had that meant you would see him at sometimes every day of the week, including Sundays?
Well, I'll give a number of examples. The first one would have been the Tottenham riots, at which the fire and rescue played a very important part, and we as the Directorate were involved. Second would be the very sad death of drummer Rigby, who was murdered, and at that point there was just myself, the fire officer, and another minister from my department running Cobra until the Home Secretary arrived. Thirdly, I beg your pardon. Thirdly, there would of course been the floods, and I think I mentioned that one of my colleagues who had responsibility had to have an eye operation, long recovery, and during that period of the floods, we worked together continuously. And when the Prime Minister couldn't chair Cobra, I chaired Cobra. That was a daily thing. And weekends, it was quite critical. And after the floods, for a period of, extended period of over 6 months, I chaired Cobra in terms of the kind of the wind-up of the floods and making sure things were in position. And he was a vital part of that process. And, that I think was Peter in the floods. But we got to know each other extremely well.
What were the circumstances in which he took you through the issues arising out of this report, which is a report about the Lacknell House fire?
I cannot be 100% certain, but I would have thought it might have been in one of our regular catch-ups.
How often did you have a regular catch-up?
Well, no less than once No less than once a month, but it could have been more.
Did he bring to your attention the point or points he makes here in the paragraph on your screen under emerging issues?
I have no recollection of him doing so. Could I just read the emergent issue again, just in case I'm... No.
No.
And then I think I would suspect that was the kind of discussion you might have with the Fire Minister.
Were you aware that in December 2010, so some months after your appointment as Secretary of State, the London Assembly's Planning and Housing Committee had produced a report called Fire Safety in London, Fire Risks in London's Tall and Timber-Framed Buildings?
No. But that would not be unusual. I would only see something like that if the private office brought it to my attention and felt I should read it. But it could be that the fire office or other, beg your pardon, the Fire Minister might have read it.
Were you aware of, in general, that the department was the subject of a recommendation that it should draw up national guidance to ensure mandatory minimum standards of competence for training and accrediting fire risk assessors?
That was in that report?
Yes, it was.
Well, I think I just said that I wasn't aware of it, and I would only have been aware of it if it had brought to my attention.
So you weren't aware of the issue either?
No, not at my level. Forgive me, but I mean, I'm running a very large department with enormous responsibilities, of which this is an important but small part.
Now let's go to turn to a different topic, and Mr. Chairman, I'm going to embark on this in the few minutes before 1 o'clock, just to make 3 minutes of headway, if I can.
Yes, all right.
Let's go, please, to CLG 3019471. This is your statement at page 7.
Okay.
And at page 7, paragraph 24, you say, under the heading Efficiencies and Public Service Reform in the Fire Sector, on 14th December 2012, Ministers asked former Chief Fire and Rescue Service Advisor Sir Ken Knight to conduct an independent review of efficiency in the provision of fire and rescue in England. Sir Ken provided his report Facing the Future in May 2013, in which he advised that substantial efficiency and productivity improvements could be made in the fire service. And you go on to identify the key findings. Did you read that report?
Yes.
You did?
Yes. Certainly the executive. I'm pretty sure I had a session with Ken just before he brought it out.
Let's go then to HOM 3046036. This is a submission from Tanny Nisbet Jones in National Fire Policy to Brandon Lewis,
Okay.
Private Secretary, dated the 8th of July 2013.
Okay.
And you can see other names there on the right. and the title is Fire, Government Response to the Night Review.
Okay.
And if we go, please, to the top of page 1, we can see the copy list, and it includes Secretaries of all Ministers, PS/Permanent Secretary, all advisors.
Okay.
Do you remember reading this document?
It's not direct to me.
No, but might this have come to you?
No.
No, right.
No, this is something that would definitely not have come to me.
Right, well then we can take it shortly. I'll ask you questions by reference to the points in it.
Okay.
Page 4, Annex A, this is excerpts from Dawn Eastmead's submission of the 7th of June, SR statement, Blue Lights Work and Government Response to the Night Review. At the bottom of the page, under the title Work Streams, if we scroll to the bottom of page 4, are you content that these themes are the themes that the response should cover? And then if we go over the page, please.
Could I just read it before you go over, please? I just wanted...
Yes, of course.
Yep.
Go back to page 4, please.
Thank you. Just a second. Yeah.
So outside the blue lights work detailed above, we'd expect to focus on the following. And then if we turn to page 5,
Yes. Okay.
and look at the last bullet point on page 5, two-thirds of the way down your screen, the scope for creating a national regulator for establishing and overseeing local approaches to supporting compliance and enforcement of the fire safety order. This could provide a consistent framework for the delivery of fire protection services, including the provision of advice and development of appropriate technical standards addressing many of the concerns businesses have raised. Did you know that that was an issue, the subject of this report?
And do we have Brandon's response to this?
Well, can you just answer my question?
Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't being... if Brandon agreed to this, then that would have, I wouldn't have had any objection to it.
Right.
But this is not something... I'm not saying this to avoid answering a question. This is just not something that would have come to me. You know, I was Secretary of State. I wasn't the Fire Minister.
I understand. But my question was simply whether you understood that this was a point, which was the subject of examination.
It was not something that was discussed with me, nor would have expected it to be discussed with me.
Right. Two more questions.
It's okay.
Brandon Lewis had been described as not keen on the idea of a national regulator. Did you know that?
I watched the session. So
did you know it at the time?
No.
Right. Now, we also know that Louise Upton was commissioned to make a start on developing a range of options. Were you aware of that at the time?
No, but I saw the session, so...
Right. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it certainly is.
Yes.
Well, Lord Pickles, slightly later than usual. We're going to break now so we can all have some lunch. We'll come back, please, at 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock, that's good.
And as I said to you before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it. I have to utter that caution every time, but
absolutely, but
I'm sure you understand why.
Absolutely.
Good, thank you. Would you like to go to the usher then, please?
Thank you.
Thank you. 2 o'clock, please. Thank you.